Well, good day, everybody. I'm astrologer Mitchell Scott Lewis in rainy New York City. And as you can see on the screen here, we're going to be looking at post-pandemic America. Because I work in America, I tend to focus on my country's situation, but we're really in a worldwide change. This is a period that has been coming along for quite some time, as we know, and new inventions and new ideas and new activity, and it's affecting the whole world. But we're going to look at some slides today that are, excuse me, focused on America's chart and on the New York Stock Exchange chart, and on the history of the stock markets, because things tend to work in cycles. And I spent quite a number of years on the floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange trading commodities and learning about the correlation between astrology and the markets. And it was a fascinating education. I got a chance to see astrology work on a day-to-day basis that many astrologers don't get a chance to do, because I was watching and building my trading techniques based on what was happening every single day, whether I was trading cotton or the stock markets or the currencies. I got a chance to see how the astrology worked within the framework of Wall Street. And what I found was that there was a great deal of correlation, not just with astrology and with the markets, but with everything that we do. We are all interconnected. And what I'm going to look at today is some of that interconnection. First of all, events take a long time to happen. People have a very short attention span. We live 70, 80 years, 100 if we're really unlucky. And so to the individual, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years seems like a long time. And in fact, in our lives, it is. But in terms of human history, it isn't that long. And in terms, of course, in galactic history, well, even humanity's only been here for a second or two. But we're not concerned with the bigger picture, at least not on that level. What I'm looking at today is the bigger picture within our society and what it is that's going to happen over the next period of time. That's what I'd like to focus on. So let's take a look. This is the chart for America that I use. Many of you understand astrology, some of you may not. It's okay, I'm going to try and explain what's going on here. This is called the Sibley chart. It's the chart that many astrologers use, and I happen to like it. It gives America a Sagittarius rising sign. And quite frankly, it's the only ascendant that makes any sense to me. For one thing, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, which is the biggest planet. And where Sagittarius falls is where we tend to expand. Well, in the 1800s, a philosophy known as manifest destiny took hold, in which it was considered that it is God's will that America grow as large as the landmass will allow. There is only one sign of the zodiac that would even think that way, and that's Sagittarius. And the ascendant in a chart has to do with the physical entity. If you have a Sag rising, you will tend to be bigger than the people in your family. Everything is genetic, of course. If you have a Sag rising, you think very big thoughts and you look for very big ideas. And that's pretty much a definition of America. But there are many different opinions about a lot of the things I'm going to discuss today, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. First thing I want to look at is this. I chose this date of February 12th, 2022, because this is when America's Pluto return begins to finally complete. Now, when you're dealing with outer planets, they take a long time for the events to occur. I don't believe that a Pluto return, for example, takes a year or two or three or five. I think it takes decades. I think that America has been building up to its Pluto return for a long time. In fact, if you look back to the Second World War, you can start to see the philosophy and the ideas that are building up to today. Now, that's a long time. Pluto was nowhere near being. It was not even in Capricorn in the Second World War. But now we are coming to this completion. And so Pluto is on top of Pluto. And we have been feeling this for some time. And what does Pluto represent? Well, it rules hidden agendas, sense of vengeance, power, power struggles. It also rules the parts of the body that eliminate waste. For example, it rules the urethra and the colon and the sweat glands, even the tear ducts, any way that we eliminate waste in our body. It rules things that are decayed and worn out. Well, one of the main issues that is going on right now is, what is Joe Biden's administration trying to accomplish? Well, one of the main issues that has been talked about for decades is that America is crumbling. We need to rebuild our infrastructure. Otherwise, we're not even in the 21st century yet, frankly. A train from Boston to Washington, D.C. should take a couple of hours. It takes a day. An example of what's happening in our country. In New York, we have, New York is on the Hudson River, and that's what connects New York and all of New England to the rest of America. There are two tunnels under the Hudson River, the Holland Tunnel and the Lincoln Tunnel. They are both quite old. They are decaying. In Hurricane Sandy, one of them was so badly damaged that essentially we're holding it together with Scotch tape and toothpicks. About 30% or more of America's economy goes through those two tunnels. Amtrak, trucking, so much commerce that if those tunnels were to collapse, we would be in a national catastrophe. There was supposed to be a third tunnel built a number of years ago, and the governor of Jersey at the time, Chris Christie, refused to sign off on the bill. So they never built the third tunnel. They were going to build the third tunnel, and when that was completed, they would start to repair and upgrade and modernize the other two, and they didn't do it. So we are standing at a precipice right now, not just in New York, but throughout America. Bridges and tunnels and subways and highways, they're crumbling. It's frightening to go across bridges because you're not sure if they're going to support your car. Well, this has been, like I said, discussed for a long time. Now, as the saying goes, push comes to shove. The Pluto return is demanding that we pay attention to this. Now, I don't want to get into the politics too much of this. I don't want to take a side between the two political parties in America or the split. But the chasm that does occur between the two parties is crippling. It's making it almost impossible to get anything done. Well, that's what we're going to see happen over the next few years. That's part of what I want to talk about today. But I'm going to also discuss the economy, Bitcoin, currencies, a lot of different things, and try and pull it all together so you understand exactly where America is at now. Now, at the same time that this is going on, Pluto return, Neptune by transit is in opposition to America's Neptune. America has a Mars-Neptune square in its natal chart. By nature, America is a centralist country. We have Saturn in the house that it rules, in the sign that it is exalted in sextile to the sun. That makes us a conservative country, but we have the moon in Aquarius and a Sagittarius rising. Both of those are rather more progressive. So we do swing a little to the left, a little to the right. If we pull too far in either direction, the collective tends to pull it back into the middle. There are exceptions to that based on circumstances. For example, in the 1930s, when we had the worst depression in human history, Roosevelt was elected and elected and elected and elected. And his goal was to pull us out of the depression. And he did it through very progressive changes. I don't want to get into Roosevelt's chart. He's an Aquarian and he fits into America's chart quite succinctly for those kinds of changes. But again, I have an hour and I want to focus on certain issues that are going to explain where we're heading. Okay, so now the title of this lecture is Post-Pandemic America. Well, are we heading into a post-pandemic period? We've heard recently about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been pulled off the market, at least temporarily. The AstraZeneca vaccine also. So there's a slowdown in vaccinations. There is some question by a lot of people as to whether they should take the vaccine or not. I don't tell people whether they should or shouldn't do something. They have to feel it within their own soul and their own spirit, how they're going to deal with things. But just to put things in perspective, the influenza epidemic started in 1918 in March. And a handful of soldiers in Kansas got sick. Some of them died, some of them recovered, so they were shipped over to the First World War, which had been going on since 1914. At that time, Neptune, which rules infectious diseases, was in conjunct to Saturn. Saturn is the planet of restriction and limitation. So, in a way, that combination restricted the outbreak of the virus temporarily. And so this war, this incubation that was occurring for 4 years in the trenches in Europe, in the most horrific circumstances you can imagine. Movies are being made about it, and it's a great thing to study how humanity works. In October of 1918, as the war was winding down, because the war ended, armistice was signed on the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th hour, purposely, because the fear that we would have another war was absolutely beyond comprehension. And so they needed to make a point, and the statement was, this is the 11th hour. If we come back here again, God only knows what will happen to humanity. And so they signed the armistice. And they started to send millions of people, soldiers and nurses and all different kinds of people, back to their home countries. At this point, Saturn is now in opposition to Uranus. This is a configuration. The hard aspects between Saturn and Uranus show up quite often in stock market crashes. We're going to look at a few of them today. And it represents a conflict between Saturn, which is stability, and Uranus, which is instability. Well, within less than a year, anywhere, depending on what numbers you read and what situations you're looking at, anywhere between 50 and 150 million people died from the influenza. One of the reasons why the numbers are so off is because India did not keep very good records, and we have no way of knowing how many people died in that country. However, many more people died in 1 year from influenza than died in the 4 years of the First World War. Europe was devastated. America lost about 500,000 people, and the only reason we lost that few is we were primarily a rural nation. So there were not big cities. Of course, we had cities, and there were tremendous outbreaks in Boston. In Boston, it was illegal to leave your house without a mask. In fact, what they told you to do in 1918 was wash your hands, wear a mask, and stay 6 feet away. Sound familiar? New York lost a lot of people. Philadelphia had a tremendous outbreak. A lot of people refused to wear a mask. In fact, there were parades for the returning troops, and they were spreaders. They were super spreaders. So nothing has really changed that much. Mankind is always struggling with germs, and with, as H.G. Wells said at the end of War of the Worlds, when the Martians have wiped out everything and none of our weapons have worked, they caught the common cold. And as Wells says, I'm paraphrasing, the tiniest thing that God in his infinite wisdom had placed upon the earth. So we only have so much power over what we're going to do and we're going to accomplish. Within the framework of that power, it's very important that we make decisions that, for one thing, are geared by common sense. And as one of my friends like to say, common sense is not that common. Okay. The start of the COVID in 2020, or at least of its exposure, because we're not sure when it actually started. What we have here is we have Neptune, again, that planet that rules infections, in sextile to Jupiter. Jupiter's expansion, but because it's a sextile, it's a more proactive and malleable energy. So at the beginning, COVID certainly scared people because we had not seen a pandemic like this. We've seen small pandemics like SARS and Ebola. But the Western world in particular had been able to avoid most of that. So this is the beginning of the pandemic, so to speak. Now we're at February 2021. And what have we got? We have Saturn in square to Uranus. And what happens? Well, a second wave and a third wave and an explosion in the number of cases. Yes, vaccines are being produced, but it was very difficult to get them out to people. And so COVID exploded yet again under the Saturn-Uranus hard aspect, similarly to the way that it did in 1918. So where we are right now is we're at the precipice, we're right at the point here. And the reason why I want to bring in the stock market and the economy, because it's all connected. If the pandemic does not subside, our economy is going to collapse. If the pandemic does subside and we get a handle on it and we are able to reopen our society, we're going to see an explosion in the stock market. Here's the Dow Jones from 1896 to 2016. I haven't updated some of these slides for a while. It's not a matter of importance right now because of what we're going to do. If you look at the Dow, it looks like it just goes up and up and up. Yeah, there are dips, of course, and we're going to talk about some of those. In fact, I'm going to discuss one of them right here. This is the Great Depression. This is 1931. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But I wanted to give you a visual of what the markets look like. Now, if we look at them, in 1907, there was the panic of 1907. Saturn, which rules stability and structure and foundation and banking currencies, was in square to Pluto. In almost every stock market crash that I've examined, in every panic or depression, Saturn is in hard aspect to the outer planets. More often than not, it's Uranus, but here's an example where it's Pluto. It doesn't matter, it had the same effect. Now, the crash of 2007 is over here, and what happens is the markets go sideways for a long time, until about 2022, when the Roaring 20s begin. Okay. Here's the Dow for 20 years. Now, it doesn't go up and up and up and up. It goes up and down. There are major dips in this, and then it tries to make a new high, and it tries again, and it tries again. Here's the crash of 1907. Here's the beginning of the First World War in 1914. Well, war is very good for the economy. It's not very good for people or animals, but it's very good for the economy. And so what happened was the markets rallied back up again until the influenza of 1918. And even though the war ends here, the flu devastated our economy. Now, we had a depression from 1920 till 1922. It's not written about that much. You have to obviously do homework and study it. It was a depression that was created for a number of reasons. First of all, the flu continued for several years. It didn't disappear in 1918. It took until 1920 before it started to really subside. Then they had millions of people come back to their home countries, and they had to put them to work. And there was no work for them. So there was a great deal of unemployment. Germany, which was forced to pay tremendous restitution for the war because they lost, slipped into depression much earlier than most of the rest of the world. In fact, through the 20s, it was in a depression. And that's one of the main reasons why the rise of Nazism occurred, because the economy was so bad. Well, you add all these things up, and it creates depression. Here's the crash of 1920 to 1922. Then the Roaring Twenties start. Here's the 1920s until 1929, when everybody knows we had a major stock market crash. Oh my God. Here it is. Here's the crash of 1931. It is so much deeper than the crash of 1929 that what it did was the markets came right back down to where they were in the crash of 1907. And what happened was, this is called support. Like I said earlier, we have a short attention span. We think that a few years is a long time, but the markets have a much, much longer memory than we do. And after the crash of 29, which was bad, it was terrible. It wiped out a tremendous amount of money. This crash was so much deeper because it comes back to support. If it had failed here, God only knows where it would have gone. But it didn't. It held support. And if you trade stocks or commodities or anything else, you learn to read these kinds of charts and you look for places of support and resistance up on top. And so in 1931, the markets held, and then they rallied up essentially until 1937, when what was known as the Roosevelt recession hit in. The Republicans won back the Senate, and so they demanded that Roosevelt balance the budget, and that led to a big recession here. And what got us out of the recession was the Second World War. As I said before, war is very good for the economy. But it took 25 years for the Dow to come back to where it had been before the crash of 29. 25 years. Now over here, what we saw was a 19-year recovery before the Dow came back to where it was and started another bull run that ended in 1929. Here, it took until 1955. Now, a little aside, which is interesting. In 1931, they built the Empire State Building. It took them 400 days. It was a massive construction project, and it was done purposely in a hurry because the Depression was setting in. Not only were they afraid that they weren't going to be able to complete the project, but they wanted to give America something to cheer about, quite honestly. And so they finished it in a little over a year. What most people don't know is that because of the Depression, it was a tremendous financial failure. It made more money from people paying a few cents to go up on the top in the observation deck and look over New York City than it made in rents. People were out of business. There was no companies. Nobody rented it. It took until the mid-50s before the Empire State Building started to make a profit. Now, what's the point of this? The point is to explain to you that recovery periods from depressions, especially we're using the stock market. Now remember, the stock market is not the economy. It is only an example. What it really is the stock market is an example of the stock market. But we used these kinds of charts to show how the economy is moving. And so my goal today is to look at what's going to be happening in the next few years to get an idea of what we can expect. Okay. The New York Stock Exchange was begun on May 17th, 1792, underneath a buttonwood tree on Wall Street, outside of 10 Wall Street. And in fact, it's called the Buttonwood Agreement. A number of New York stock market traders said, why don't we have our own stock market? Europe has theirs, Britain has theirs, other countries have theirs. So they decided that that's the day they're going to start it. And that's the day that they signed the agreement, and that's the first day that there was a trade on the New York Stock Exchange. In 1931, when the markets crashed, we had Saturn square Uranus opposed by Neptune. Here's the Saturn to the outer planets, a massive, massive buildup. And the Saturn-Uranus square sits on top of the New York Stock Exchange. I'm sorry, that's not transiting Neptune. That's Neptune in the New York Stock Exchange's chart. The New York Stock Exchange has the moon conjunct Saturn in opposition to Jupiter and Neptune. It's an illusion. All the markets are an illusion. I give you a piece of paper with Ben Franklin's picture on it, and you give me a pair of sneakers. Why? Because we agree. We're playing Monopoly, and that's what it's worth. So this square, the Saturn-Uranus square, slams the New York Stock Exchange's chart, and it leads to the massive crash that we looked at all the way down here to where the markets were in 1907. Then we start this build, and we have, after the Second World War, a huge bull market, my goodness, until we get to the 1960s and 70s, when for 16 years, in 1982, the stock market was exactly where it had been in 1965. They kept trying to make a new high and it failed. And they made a slightly new high and it failed. And here's another one and it failed. Now, those who were alive in that period, you may remember that in the 1970s into the early 80s, you could get 12% interest on your checking account. Like to get that today. The reason is because inflation was out of hand. And nobody knew what to expect. There was no stability here for 16 years. So here we have a big run-up, and it from the bottom, of course, it runs all the way up. And here it starts a new bull market, which after a few years starts to run out of steam. Then in 1982, we have the beginning of a very long bull market with dips. The markets always go up and down. But here we have till the early 2000s into the 90s, and then we have more. I'm not going to go over every stock market crash here. I'm going to be doing a longer webinar strictly on the financial markets, but there's a great deal I want to cover today. But I just wanted to show you this. And here's the crash of 08. The crash of 08 had Saturn. Let me see, do I have that here? No. Okay. It had Saturn in opposition to Neptune, right on top of the New York Stock Exchange's Mars. And in my rectification, I give Mars rulership of the 10th house of career and status. And Saturn was in opposition to Uranus right on top of Mars. And that's why I was able to predict the 08 crash more than a year in advance, within a couple of weeks of its occurrence. And again, I could have spent this entire time talking just about the stock market. I didn't want to do that. I want to tie everything in and try and explain to you what I think is going to be happening over the next period of time. And I have an hour, so I have to squeeze things in. I will be doing a webinar. It'll be announced on my website, on Facebook, wherever, smoke signals, any way I can get it to be. Okay. We are in a new era. There's no question about it. The internet has been rolling along, it's a mixed blessing, of course, for quite some time. We've accepted it. I now carry a phone that has more power and more memory in it than every computer, up to perhaps 25 years ago could even imagine. Things are changing. Digitizing is here. It's not going away. Is Bitcoin real? Is it a bubble? Is it both? Bitcoin was begun on January 3rd, 2009. That was the first trade. It has a Saturn-Uranus opposition in its chart. That implies great erratic behavior, just like it does when there's a stock market crash. In the very natal chart of Bitcoin is built in this erraticness. Here's Bitcoin. I didn't update this to the recent explosion up into the 65,000 range, but Bitcoin did very little, ran up a little bit, came back down again, ran all the way up in 2015. And then here it shows this great erraticness. And then again, it's very erratic. And here you see, I've updated this particular one to where Bitcoin hit 40,000. Today it's around 63,000. This is in January. What is Bitcoin? It's money. In ancient times, I gave you a cow, a sheep, and a bushel of grain, and you let me live in the house or on your land. You gave me 2 cows, I gave you farm stuff, and this was called barter. Somewhere along the line, they invented money, coins. Mostly it was precious metals, silver, gold, and they traded in that way. Then we eventually got to a point where most countries ran on the silver or the gold standard. In the First World War, most of the countries, including America and the European nations, were on the gold standard. And they all had to pay to keep the war going. They had to pay their armies. So most of the European nations lied about how much gold they had. And they printed more money. Before Andrew Jackson, there was no paper money. There was currency made out of precious metals, gold eagles, silver coins, so on and so forth. Then we started paper money. And now what we deal with is what's called fiat money. It's not backed by anything. We're not on the gold standard. We can never go back on the gold standard. Gold would have to be worth $1 million an ounce in order to have enough gold to back the trillions and trillions of dollars that we have created. So what's holding it all together? Well, we're playing Monopoly, basically. You land on my property, you have to give me some of these papers that say money, and I take them, and that's what we do. And when my brother and I were kids, we would sometimes play Monopoly where we'd make the $100, $100,000, and the dollars $1,000. It doesn't matter what you call it. Only matters that we all agree on what it's worth. So what is Bitcoin worth? Well, I've heard some people and some astrologers on radio shows and in interviews say that money is going to disappear. Currency is going to disappear. It's all going to be digital. It's possible. I say to them, Bitcoin is now worth 62,000. They say, yeah. I say, 62,000 what? They look at me strangely. They say, what do you mean? $62,000. Exactly. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it or smoke it. It's not going to take you out on a date. You can't go to the movies with it. It's money. And money is only worth anything based on what we all agree it's based on. The currencies throughout the world trade in what's called a basket. The dollar trades against the pound and the euro and the Swiss franc and the Canadian dollar and the yen. And they all trade together. And if there's a problem in a country and the country has a revolution or a collapse, their currency goes way down. And then they often have massive inflation because it costs so much money in order to buy anything. This is what happened in Germany. Before the war, before Hitler took over and changed the economy, you needed a barrel full of money to buy a loaf of bread because the money was worthless. Well, if that happens today, what is Bitcoin going to be worth? What are you going to do with Bitcoin? I have some friends who hoard silver and gold coins. I say to them, okay, I have no problem with investing in the metals and putting it in part of your portfolio. You have bonds, you have stocks, you have commodities, you have this, you have that, you buy real estate, and you hold some gold as a hedge against inflation. I say to them, what do you think you're going to do with those coins? If the whole system collapses, you think that a truck driver is going to drive his truck to your house and give you food and toilet paper and stuff, and you're going to give him those coins? Those coins are going to be useless. They're only worth anything against the currencies. Now, could the currencies change? Absolutely, of course. Anything's possible. It has happened several times in our society over the last several hundred years. We have changed the way that we look at money. When Nixon took us off the gold standard, he really had no choice because gold was no longer going to be able to keep up with the growth that occurred. And so all the other currencies eventually went off the gold standard. Doesn't mean that our countries don't hold gold. The Chinese are hoarding it. There's a lot of philosophy behind it all. My concern is what's happening with Bitcoin. It's trading at $62,000 a coin. Okay. And not just Bitcoin. There are other cryptocurrencies coming out. They're being embraced by some of the banks and by some of the countries, but they still represent a tiny little bit of commerce. For one thing, nobody knows who owns it. That's not going to remain true if the value of Bitcoin continues to grow into the trillions and trillions of dollars. Governments are going to step in and say, well, okay, how much money did you make off your Bitcoin? You got to pay taxes. You have to tell us what's out there. Otherwise, we can't run a society where everything is interconnected, where what I make for my livelihood and what my house is worth and whether I'm going to go on vacation or buy a new car or go to the supermarket. This is what we call economics. It's all interconnected. Right now, cryptocurrencies are not interconnected. One of the reasons why a lot of people are concerned and don't want to use cryptocurrency is because you don't know from one minute to the next what it's worth. If you watch CNBC or any of the other financial markets, they now have Bitcoin up there. They have the Dow and the S&Ps and the NASDAQ and Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is going crazy. In fact, when GameStop ran up to $600 a share, they had that up there too. And the reason why they have Bitcoin up there is because we need to have an idea of what this currency is worth and what it's going to do to the future. Now, again, here's the chart of Bitcoin, Saturn opposite Uranus. Right now, I drew this up for March of 2022. Right now, Neptune is right over here. It's at around 20, 21 degrees of Pisces. I do a lot of work on bubbles and busts because society for centuries, for millennia, have been a combination of bubbles, whether it's the tulip bulb bubble of the 1600s or the South Sea bubble of the 1700s. These are things I'm going to go into in my longer webinar, or whether it's the dot-com bubble or whatever it is. We love bubbles because things start to slow down. You can't make money if the markets aren't going up or down. If they go up and you buy it, you can make money. If they go down and you sell it, you can make money. There's an old saying on Wall Street: bulls make money, bears make money, pigs get slaughtered. If you are willing to take some profits out of a trade, look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I know some people who bought a few $1,000s worth of Bitcoins. It's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars now. Well, when I was on the floor of the exchange, the dot-com bubble hit. And what really set it off was that Uranus, now remember, the planet Uranus was all things technological. This is why Uranus in opposition to Saturn in the Bitcoin chart implies Saturn being stability, Uranus being instability and technological stuff, that what we are looking at is an explosion in technological economics. The dot-com bubble happened when Uranus entered into Aquarius, and then at one point Jupiter came in for a year and it exploded. It just went ridiculously high. I had friends who never had any real money. They were, they worked as clerks down on the floor. Some of them weren't even on the floor, and they had bought into the dot-com bubble. And when it started to collapse as Jupiter left Aquarius, and I begged them all, this is what I was hired to come on the floor as an astrologer. And I said, this is the top of the bubble. You have to get out. And they refused to. Several of them refused to. And I had one friend who had $1 million, more than $1 million, never had that kind of money in his life. And he refused to get out of the trade as it started to go down. No, it's going to go back up. It's going to go back up. And he wound up having to sell his car for a margin call. Is the same thing going to happen with Bitcoin? Well, Neptune also had a lot to do with all of those bubbles that I mentioned before. And again, when I have more time, I will delve into them more deeply. But Neptune right now has been across Uranus and Saturn, and it's sitting right there in Bitcoin's chart. Now, Neptune is going to stay at 2021 degrees straight through the year 2021. So I don't think the bubble is done. In 2024, Saturn comes along and sits there. Now, when I do these kinds of lectures, I don't tell people what stocks to buy. I don't even like to tell them what I think the markets are going to do. Yes, it's part of my job. I'm a predictive astrologer, and so I do make predictions about the economy, certainly, and I go on a lot of shows to do just that. But I'm not going to tell you whether you should or you shouldn't buy Bitcoin, whether you should or you shouldn't get the vaccine, whether you should or you shouldn't do anything. I'm only going to point out what I see and the patterns that I have seen time and time again in my studies. When Neptune is done with a bubble, it doesn't immediately necessarily collapse, but the illusion that Neptune has created starts to fade away. And when you replace Neptune with Saturn, all of a sudden reality sits in. This doesn't mean that Bitcoin goes out of business, but one of the issues that has been brought up lately quite a bit is that to mine cryptocurrencies, they say that creating Bitcoin uses as much energy as a nation uses. We are at a point where, remember I talked earlier about Pluto, the Pluto return and the infrastructure and the collapse of what's happening, not just in America, but in other countries too. We are at a point where if the environment is not dealt with correctly, what good is any of this going to do? What good is your house going to do on the coast if the seas keep rising? What good is your money going to do you in the bank if there's nothing to eat and there's no, So what's happening is that we are at a point where environmentalism is no longer a joke. It never should have been. And as Neil Young sang many years ago, look at Mother Nature on the run in the 1970s. And here we are 50 years later. And of course, the storms and the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the rest of it. It's escalating. And anybody who doesn't believe it's escalating, well, I can't force you to believe in science. But here we have a currency, a commodity, so to speak, that is using enough energy to feed an entire nation. Eventually, that push is going to come to shove. And that's not going to be acceptable to the world. You know, Miami is one of my favorite cities. I love Miami Beach. I love water. And when people run around half naked, they tend to be much pleasanter. And I just love the sunshine, and I love it. And it's you know, it's a charming place. I could live without South Beach, but I really love the area. In Miami Beach, there's a road called Lincoln Road. It cuts through the center of it, with very high-end restaurants and shops, and it's a delightful place to take a stroll. Now, on a full moon or a high tide, there's about a foot or two of water, and they don't know what to do with it. Because really, Miami Beach is nothing but a sandbar. They don't know what to do with the Florida Keys, and they don't know what to do in New Jersey. The shoreline hangs off the edge of the continent. And New Jersey's shore brings in more than half of the economy for the state. If the sea continues to rise, there will no longer be a Jersey Shore, Long Island, all of these places. And all of this is escalating, and it's happening faster and faster, faster even than the doomsday scientists predicted it would. And here you have a commodity, Bitcoin, that is using up enough energy so that it is becoming a potential catastrophe for humanity. And we're going to continue to mine it. And we're going to have other currencies, cryptocurrencies. At some point, like I said before, push will come to shove. Now, I expected a stock market correction when Saturn squared Uranus a few months ago. And in fact, the NASDAQ did go into correction territory. It went down about 15%. But the S&Ps and the Dow didn't. I was a little surprised, but nothing shocks me too much with the stock markets. But very often when there is a hard aspect between Saturn and Uranus, there is a major drop in the markets, which shows a drop in society. Remember 2008, in 2005, I was doing a lot of radio shows, and I started to predict before that in 2004 that the housing bubble was going to pop. And the reason was because Saturn was traveling through the sign of Cancer. Saturn rules real estate, Cancer rules the home. They are polarities. Saturn opposes Cancer, and very often oppositions work together jointly to create an event. And I said that when Saturn leaves Cancer, that's going to be the top of the housing market. There are some YouTubes out there. I made these predictions. I was doing a series of lectures at the Princeton Club at the time. And if you look, July of 2005 is the exact month when Saturn left Cancer and entered Leo and began an opposition to Neptune. And it was the exact top of the housing market. And then, of course, in those days, you could make $30,000 a year and they'd give you a mortgage for a house worth $750,000. You could live for 200 years and never pay it off. It was corrupt. It was corrupt on a massive, massive scale. They were giving these mortgages out. They were repackaging them. They were calling them securities and selling them. And hedge funds were buying them, and pension funds were buying them, and countries were buying them. And Ireland and Iceland and Greece and Spain and Italy, all of those countries almost went out of business. They got absolutely crippled when the housing market collapsed. And that led, among other things, to the crash of 2008 and the Lehman Brothers, the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And all this occurred with Saturn in opposition to Uranus. Well, I know that 2031 seems like a long way off, but like I said before, it's 10 years is a long time to you and me. It's not a long time to the markets. It's not a long time to the world. Some of the events that we are creating right now and the situations that we are putting together right now are going to come to fruition in about 10 years. Remember, 2008 was a devastating stock market crash, and yet almost, in 2010, there was another dip, and that was where you bought. And if you could have bought there, you would have made a fortune just holding the S&Ps. Okay, so in 2031, Saturn's going to conjunct Uranus with Jupiter in opposition. Here's what it does to America's chart. America has a Mars-Neptune square. America is a fearful country. We are conservative, like I said before. Saturn is sextile to the Cancer sun, 4 planets in Cancer. Cancer tends to be a conservative sign, and I'm not talking about politics here, because conservative and reactionary and progressive, those terms change from generation to generation. I'm talking about the way one looks at life and their own sense of security. We also are in a progressive country with the moon in Aquarius and the Sag rising. And what happens in 1931 is that the Saturn-Uranus conjunct will sit on top. Now, I just picked this date arbitrarily, so it doesn't have to be exact. And remember, events don't have to necessarily occur when an aspect in astrology is an exactitude. It can happen before or after. These planets and Jupiter are in opposition to Mars and squaring Neptune. This is the fearfulness of America. This is what makes us a bit of a paranoid country. Sometimes a politician's chart will fall on America's chart in a way that leads that person to be elected to president or some other thing. For example, Donald Trump's full moon eclipse sits right on top of America's Mars and squares the Neptune. That is not a political statement, by the way. It's simply a statement of fact. It was powerful enough to lead him to be elected. Well, we're going to see this occur in about 10 years. So what happens before then? Now, here's my opinion. Our economy is heating up. We saw some of the examples of it recently. The GDP is growing exponentially. Unemployment is shrinking. We are opening up more and more of our economy, again post-pandemic, which is the title of this talk. And I believe that there's a pretty good chance that we are going to enter into the Roaring '20s again. Now, the last time we had the Roaring '20s, it took until 2022 for it to begin. And then in 1922. And then in 1929, all hell broke loose. And it led to a Great Depression. If we do not deal with the infrastructure, if the Pluto return of America's chart is not dealt with intelligently, this is all going to fall apart. If we cannot find common ground across the chasm that has become American politics, all of this is going to fall apart. Oh, we'll have a boost. It may even last a few years. Remember, you don't know when the top of a bubble is going to hit. Anybody who thinks that they can figure out when a bubble is going to pop, yes, we use astrology and use technologicals and things. Bitcoin has never been up at 60,000 before. How do you know when the top is going to be? Could it go to 100,000? It could. At some point, it's going to hit its peak. And when it hits its peak, one of two things is going to happen. Either it will fall into a trading range as gold did, or it will collapse. However that happens, When we get deeper into the 2020s, we're going to start to see examples of what we can and can't accomplish. I believe in free will astrology. If I didn't believe that we could make changes, I would have quit doing astrology a long time ago. I've seen clients and friends make massive changes in their lives. People who have health issues turn their lives around. Marriages get healed or separate, but in a more passive and peaceful manner. I've seen a lot of changes that occur. And I believe that we can do it personally and collectively. We are there right now. Is Joe Biden going to get everything he wants in his infrastructure bill? No, it's not the way politics work. Will they shut him down? That's possible. If they do, God help us. We need to make these changes. We need to rebuild our subways, our trains, our tunnels, bridges, highways. We need to get into electric cars. There's no question but that oil, which I will also discuss in that webinar, but I don't have time for it today. Oil is a dying commodity, but will it die quickly or will it linger for another generation? Probably it will linger. But I would say that in another 10, 15 years, the only countries that will use fossil fuels mostly will be third world countries. We can't do it anymore. You can't keep burning coal. You can't keep burning fossil fuels and heating up the planet, because I don't care whether you believe in science or you don't. Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Now, okay, my commercial. Here's my biography. These are my murder mysteries. Please, if you like mysteries, they're a lot of fun. And if you'd like to talk to me or you want a reading or something, mitchastro.com. But this is where I want to leave off. We have a period of time now when we may make changes. I believe we are in a period of radical change. I'm quite shocked by some of the things that Joe Biden is trying to do. I don't want to get into my personal feelings politically, but if we didn't make changes, I don't know what to tell you. So he is doing some things rather radically, which I'm surprised about. Personally, I'm delighted because I think we do need to go in that direction. But again, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. But if we don't make these changes, and if we don't do it soon, 10 years, come on. Anybody who's lived as long as I have knows that 10 years, you sneeze, 10 years goes by. We have to make these changes, and we have to do it now. And if we can, certainly if we can find compromise, that would be wonderful. I would love to see bipartisanship and America's politics go back kind of the way they were. I don't know that they were ever 100%, but that would be nice. But otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to see this tug of war back and forth and back and forth. And we'll go one step forward and two steps back. And in 10 years' time, when this configuration hits, we are going to be in a mess. So I'm optimistic by nature. A lot of Jupiter and Sag in my chart. I believe that we can do this. I hope that we find the direction and the way. But I have seen historically how many times we have been put at a place where it's very obvious what has to be done, and people go, meh, I'll worry about it later. That Hitler has a cute little mustache and he makes the trains run on time, so what could be bad? Anyway, it's been a delight chatting with you all, and anybody who would like to talk to me, please contact me at mitchastro.com. Please sign up for my free monthly newsletter. I've been doing it since 1999. Buy the Murder Mysteries. They're a lot of fun. I have another one coming out soon. And I hope to be back on Coast to Coast soon, too. I enjoy the time, although the show runs from 1 till 5 in the morning in New York, so I have to set the alarm, get up, and deal with it. Anyway, would love to hear from anybody that has an opinion or would like to further discuss this. Linda, it's been terrific. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to further webinars. And you know, I think our time's just about up. Or what have we got?